Hello and welcome to Roportaj. This is Daanish with Nabi. In today's segment of Roportaj, I am joined by former Ambassador Mr. Dilip Sinha to talk about his recently released book, Imperial Games in Tibet, which is published by Pan MacMillian. The book talks in detail about the great game between UK and USSR in 18th and 19th century in the Central Asia, and how London helped Chinese to establish its control on the autonomous region of Tibet. More from the author about the Mr. Sinha, in the book, in the start of the book, you write that British helped this king, which oblique Manchu Empire, when it was about to disintegrate in mid 1860s or mid 1850s. Why did British help an empire which was about to disintegrate?
This was part of the great game in Central Asia that Britain and Russia were playing. Now, most people are aware of the idea of the great game, that is, rivalry between Britain and Russia in Central Asia. What people are not particularly familiar with is the role of China in this great game. Now, China was the first entrant in Central Asia. It had entered Central Asia in the middle of the 18th century, 100 years before Russia and Britain came on the scene. But 100 years later, in the middle of the 19th century, around 1850, 1860, when Britain and Russia became strong in Central Asia, the Chinese Manchu Empire, which is called the Qing dynasty, the Manchus took a Chinese name, Qing, and they called themselves the Qing dynasty. That dynasty had become very weak. And there came a time when, because of the European invasions and the Russian invasions, the Manchu dynasty became very weak. And because of this, a civil war started inside China, where the Han Chinese revolted against the Manchus. And the country was almost divided into two parts. Around this time, Britain invaded Beijing, captured Beijing, and the emperor fled north to Manchuria, to his home place, and he died over there. But then Britain realized that unlike in India, where a few years ago, when the Indian revolt had taken place, they had removed the Mughal emperor, taken into Myanmar, and taken over the entire country. In China, they could not do this because they were not strong enough. In China, Russia was much stronger than Britain. So Britain feared that if the Chinese empire collapsed, then the main beneficiary would be Russia and not Britain. So Britain, very soon after capturing Beijing, decided that they would restore the Manchu dynasty, and not only restore it, they would help it overcome the civil war. So British soldiers and naval officers were allowed to come and serve the Manchu emperor, to join the Chinese army and help them overcome the civil war. And then the outlying areas which had broken away from the Manchu Empire, they were helped by Britain to be reconquered. So this is how Britain helped the Chinese empire, the Manchu Empire in China, to re-establish itself.
So basically, the point is, the UK just wanted to keep Russia out of this area. That's why they helped Beijing. That's why they helped the Manchus. Am I right?
Yes, you're absolutely correct here. Unlike in India, where Britain had been able to defeat all its rivals, the main rival was France. Therefore, Britain had no European rival in India. They only had Indians to conquer. In China, Britain was not strong enough to conquer all of China. It had to contend with Russia, with France, with Portugal. Later, even Japan and America came into the scene. So in this situation, Britain felt that it was better to revive the Chinese empire and re-establish it, rather than try and carve out the empire among the various European powers.
Now to the another episode which you have mentioned in the book is about Shaidullah. Initially, China refused to take this area, but when they took it, Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir, Shaidullah, which belonged to the erstwhile Jammu and Kashmir, completely kept mum when Chinese retook this Shaidullah. Which is this place? Many scholars and new authors are writing about this place, that it belonged to the erstwhile Jammu and Kashmir. So, which is this place? Where is this Shahidullah exactly located?
You see, if you look at the map of Jammu and Kashmir, that is the portion of Ladakh, in the northern portion, the Karakoram range comes down, and you have a pass called the Karakoram Pass. This pass is currently considered to be the border between India and Xinjiang or China, whatever you call it. Across the Karakoram Pass, there is a vast area which has a stream called the Karakash stream, and you have to pass this highland. It's barren, and after that, when you move further north, you come to the Kunlun mountain. That's another mountain range, and there are a number of passes in this Kunlun mountain range. When you cross the Kunlun mountain range, then you come into what is called, what China calls Xinjiang, and what the people of the region called East Turkestan, where you have towns like Kashgar, Yarkand, and Khotan. Now, these are ancient towns with a very long history. And this area had been conquered first by China in the middle of the 18th century, in about 1759 or so. But this area had revolted repeatedly against Chinese rule. In fact, in 1820, just about 60 years later, 50 years later, the Chinese were overthrown here. Then they came back. Then they were overthrown again. And finally, when the civil war started in China in the middle of the around 1750, 1850, Chinese rule here became extremely weak and they were overthrown. Then in later, in about 1875 or so, the British helped China reconquer this region. Now, when the Chinese came back and reconquered East Turkestan, they were still very scared of going out of the towns, and they preferred to stay in their garrisons in the towns. And they were not prepared to come south of the Kunlun Mountains into this barren area that I mentioned, where there was one little, uh, uh, hardly a habitation, which was inhabited mainly by Kyrgyz herdsmen. And here, the Maharaja of Kashmir, whose Diwan Mehta, Mehta was
Chand
named,
Mehta.
some Mehta, Chand Mehta, somebody who was the governor of Ladakh, he had built a fort in this place, and they had kept the fort for some time. Then later on, there was a person in Yaqub Beg in East Turkestan who became the ruler of East Turkestan. He also came and he conquered this region for some period of time. After Yaqub Beg was defeated by the Chinese and was overthrown, the Maharaja of Kashmir wanted to go back and re-establish authority in Shahidullah. By this time, the British had annexed Punjab, and they had given Gulab Singh the Maharajaship of Jammu and Kashmir. They did not want the Maharaja of Kashmir to go beyond this region, and they also did not want the Russians to come into this region because the Russians had come into Central Asia and they could also come in. So the British encouraged the Chinese to come down and occupy this region. And there was a lot of correspondence that took place between the British and the Chinese, convinced the Chinese that it was important for them to come down and occupy this region. And finally, it was in 1792 when a Chinese force came down to the Karakoram Pass and set up what it called a pillar, a border pillar in the Karakoram Pass. It was just a little little mound of stones that they put. And the British said that now this is okay because we have a friendly power that is occupying this region rather than Russia.
Yaqub Beg, this interesting character, which you have also mentioned in the book, had London not backed up Chinese against Yaqub Beg, would things have been different in this part of world right now?
That's very difficult to say because Yaqub Beg himself was not a Uyghur. He was from Kokand and he had come down. He was a soldier of fortune. And this place was ruled essentially by a community called the Khojas, who were a sort of a spiritual leadership. And Yaqub Beg himself was also an upstart. And he was not very popular among the people, but he was a good soldier and he was able to establish his authority. So his primary aim was to get himself recognized, which is why he went and wanted to have established relations with Russia, with Britain. He also asked the Ottoman ruler, the Ottoman Caliph, to give him a title, and he was given the title of Amirul Mominin by the Caliph, so that the people would accept him as their ruler. So there were all these issues. It was a very disturbed area and place, which is why the Chinese were very scared, even when they reconquered the place. They were not confident of going out and running the administration of the place the way any other government would.
1816, Britain conquers Nepal, Kathmandu, and Nepal consistently had asked Chinese to post their agent into Kathmandu, but China flatly refuses. Then again in 1840s, 1850s, when Nepalese rose against British, they again asked the Chinese emperor to send to give them the relief so that they can fight against the British. Why did China refuse to help Nepal in 1816 as well as in 1830s and 1840s?
Well, the main reason for that was that China did not really have any capacity to help. Chinese rule over Tibet, especially Manchu rule, was a kind of an overlordship where the Manchu emperor posted a representative called the Amban, who was a high official, who was always a Manchu.
But in early 1800s, wasn't Chinese emperor as strong because British conquered China in 1850s or 1860s? 60s. They could have helped the Nepalese.
You see, even before, when the Manchus conquered Tibet, their conquest of Tibet was not a conquest in which they kept a very large military force in Lhasa. What they did was they kept an Amban with a small protection force for the Amban himself. And the leadership in Tibet at that time was the leadership of the Lamas, who were held in very high reverence by the Manchu rulers themselves. So the Manchu rulers regarded the Lamas as their priests, as their gurus. So the Lamas, and they allowed Lamas complete internal freedom. So the Lamas were completely autonomous in running the administration of Tibet, and the Amban was only there to help them, and occasionally when they needed help, to keep foreigners out. But there were no foreigners wanting to invade Tibet. The first time in the 19th century, Tibet was threatened was only in 1841 when Zorawar Singh attacked Taklakot, and then later Nepal attacked Tibet. So there were instances, but in all these cases, the Chinese forces in Tibet were very small. I don't have the exact numbers, but they're not more than a few hundred. The main force that had come into Tibet was in 1793, when there had been an invasion by Nepal, and the Nepalese forces had gone and plundered the monastery in Shigatse. At that time, when Tibet appealed, and that was almost the second or the third invasion of Nepal of Tibet, and in the earlier invasions, the Chinese emperor had not intervened. But in 1793, when Nepal attacked, then the Chinese emperor sent a big force, which came down, crossed the Himalayas, and then headed towards Kathmandu. And then there was a peace was established, and both money was paid by both sides. Tibet also paid some indemnity to Nepal because China wanted peace to be established so that the army could go back to China. China did not keep a large force in Lhasa because there was no major threat either to Chinese rule there or to the country itself from its neighbors.
Mr. Sinha, another important character which you have touched upon in the book is about Lord Curzon, who was one of the widely traveled person in this Central Asian area. And in 1899, he gave this forward policy, Curzon's forward policy. What was this forward policy?
See, what had happened was that Curzon became Governor General of India in 1899. 9 years before that, in 1890, Britain had signed its first treaty with China regarding the border between India and Tibet. It was basically the border of Sikkim with Tibet. And then 3 years later, they signed a set of regulations and a trade agreement which would allow British goods, especially tea, to be sold and to be imported in Tibet. But Tibet was not a party to this agreement, and the Tibetans refused to accept it or recognize it. So when the British tried to go and sell their goods, send their goods across to Tibet, also to set up border pillars, the Tibetans would oppose them, not permit them. So this was the British kept protesting to both the Tibetans and to the Chinese about this. China could not do anything because China was not able to force the Tibetans to do anything, but they had very little force in Lhasa. And the Tibetans refused to take orders from them. When Curzon came to India, Curzon was, as I mentioned, he had very high, big ambitions, a very imperialistic ruler. He insisted that Tibet must implement the agreement. So he wrote a letter to the Dalai Lama asking him to implement the agreement. But the letter was taken by the official at the border and not sent to Lhasa. He kept it with him for 6 months and then sent it back unopened to Lord Curzon, which infuriated him. And he wrote back to his government saying, how can there be a country which is within a few hundred kilometers of the British Empire, and it doesn't have relations with Britain, and it refuses to have relations with Britain? So it was to implement that 1890 agreement that Curzon actually forced London to allow him to invade Tibet. And he managed to get his force across to Lhasa in 1904. But Britain immediately repudiated the agreement and reprimanded young husband. Curzon himself was very strong politically, so he was not reprimanded, but young husband was. And within 2 years, Britain signed another agreement with China, under which the 1904 agreement signed by Curzon was changed, and the new agreement overtook its place.
You you write in the book that Curzon's invasion of Tibet set things right for China in Tibet. How did this invasion help the Chinese to set things themselves right for the Tibet inside that autonomous region of Tibet?
In fact, that was the time when actual Chinese rule started in Tibet. Because when young husband invaded Lhasa in 1904, the 13th Dalai Lama fled from Lhasa. He fled to Mongolia. So there was no Dalai Lama in Lhasa. And the Chinese took full advantage of this. They declared, they took away the title of the Dalai Lama. And then they started interfering and sending people across to Lhasa in the government. And the British encouraged them in this. By this time, movement to Lhasa had become easier because you could move from Hong Kong to Calcutta. From Calcutta, you could go across to Lhasa. And so when the 1906 agreement was signed, that agreement was the first agreement in which, in the agreement itself, Britain recognized Chinese suzerainty over Tibet. Earlier, there was no agreement of this kind. And soon after that, the Chinese appointed a very powerful and very strong governor in the province of Sichuan, which is next to the Kham province of Tibet. And this governor was also appointed simultaneously Amban in Lhasa, which is quite unprecedented. Amban was supposed to be a resident in Lhasa. So this governor then invaded Lhasa. And since there was nobody there to resist him, a lot of atrocities there. And he's called the Butcher of Lhasa. So the Chinese took full advantage of the defeat and the absence of the Dalai Lama to establish their firm presence in Lhasa.
Importantly, this 1907 agreement, you have also raised this question in the book. Why did not British kept Tibet for itself? Why did it give to the Chinese when it could have easily kept the autonomous region under itself?
That is where Russia comes in.
Oh.
If you look at the correspondence that took place between when young husband invaded Lhasa, one of the reasons given by Curzon one of the justifications given by Curzon to his government in London was that the Russians had sent weapons to Lhasa to arm the Tibetan government. Of course, young husband couldn't find any Russian weapons in Tibet. But when young husband marched into Tibet, the Russians protested very strongly to Britain, saying that Britain was violating uh, Tibet, which was part of China, and Russia would not tolerate that. So the British kept explaining to the Russians that they were in Tibet only to implement this 1890 agreement. And as soon as the Tibetans agreed to accept the trade regulations and trade agreement, they would withdraw. And they did that. In fact, Russia itself had also sent a delegation to Tibet the moment it heard about the young husband invasion. But this was a time when Russia was also in great difficulty because 1904 was the year when it had a war with Japan, and Russia was defeated in that war. But despite that, Britain realized that Russia was an influence in Central Asia and it could not annoy Russia. And Britain was also very unsure about its ability to control Tibet because of its mountainous terrain and its difficult conditions. Britain's experience in Afghanistan had not been good. Britain had tried twice to invade Afghanistan and annex it, but on both occasions it had faced a lot of difficulty. So Britain was scared of going across the mountains in difficult areas where there were people who could be a threat to the British. So Britain felt that it was safest to have the agreement with Russia that Tibet would remain a part of the Chinese Empire. And this was the agreement that Britain and Russia signed in 1907, 1 year after the British signed an agreement with China.
Mr. Sinha, 7 years down the line, Treaty of Shimla, 1913 and 1914. There two agreements have been reached between India and Tibet border in Arunachal Pradesh and another autonomy of the Outer Tibet. This was Treaty of Shimla in 1913 and 1914. But China rejects both now.
Well, yes, China was at this time going through a very difficult time.
The civil war phase.
Well, the ruling, the Manchu dynasty had abdicated.
Had collapsed, yeah.
In 1912, had collapsed. It had abdicated. And there were two governments in China at this time. 1900 and there was a government in
Beijing
southern China,
and
in the south capital, Beijing, and in Nanjing. So Britain was in a difficult situation. Sorry, China was in a difficult situation. But at the same time, Britain wanted to reassure itself that the border between Tibet and India was settled, and also the border between Tibet and China should also be settled, while accepting that Tibet was under the suzerainty of China. Because it felt that unless this was done, it could not maintain its equanimity with Russia, because Russia was constantly protesting against any British encroachments in Central Asia. But this was also the time, you must remember, that the First World War was about to break out in Europe. So it was a very difficult time and a very complicated time. The negotiations that took place in Shimla, they tried to settle the border between Tibet and China. And China refused to accept that border, whether it was the Yangtze River would be the border between China and Tibet, or it would be some other place. But the main objection that the Chinese delegation raised in Shimla was to that border, the border between Tibet and China. It did not object to the what is called the MacMahon line, the border between Tibet and Arunachal Pradesh, which was signed between the Tibetan Lobsang Chatra was his name, the Tibetan representative, and the British representative MacMahon. So that is how the McMahon line was drawn at the Shimla
which
Agreement.
which now Chinese reject both.
Yes, China rejects both for various reasons. One is that since Tibet was not a sovereign country, China said that Tibet did not have the authority to sign an agreement. Also, since China did not sign or ratify the agreement on the McMahon Shatra line, therefore, China claims that it is not valid.
Let me skip the Manchurian politics, Japanese in Manchuria, how Russians helped communists against nationalists in China. Let me skip also this Asian conference in 1947, which was held by Nehru in New Delhi, where the Chinese got offended when Mr. Nehru addresses Tibet as a separate nation. Let me directly jump to the, because of shortage of the time, directly jump to the first ambassador, K.M. Panikkar, in Beijing. When Chinese used to call Nehru running dog of imperialism, this is after 1947, Panikkar did not report it to the New Delhi. He did not report it to the Nehru. He was sympathetic to the Chinese cause for on the Tibet issue. Why did Panikkar mislead his own country?
That's very difficult to explain. Panikkar was a very intelligent man. He believed he wrote he was a strategic thinker who believed in Asian resurgence. Perhaps his thinking was that the communism is the new wave in the world. It's the anti-imperialist wave, and if India and the communists in China could join hands, they would become the new force against European imperialism and stand for freedom and equality. That is perhaps the best construct one can give. But when going through the papers, I found that in the Ministry of External Affairs, people like G.S. Bajpayee, who was the Secretary General, K.P.S. Menon, who was the Foreign Secretary, they were very disappointed in Mr. Panikkar. And they felt that he was not representing our case properly in China. In fact, Panikkar had to be pulled up several times. But Panikkar, being a very big, had a very high reputation as a big thinker. Prime Minister Nehru trusted him a lot, and in that process, they ignored the negative points that came out of China, the hostility that the communist Chinese had towards India. That was ignored. Also ignored was the communist China's expansionist policies, their eagerness to use force to enforce what they thought was their territory, whether it was in Tibet or in Taiwan or in Korea. The aggressiveness. After all, the communists had come to power by military force. They had fought civil war and seized power by force. That element was ignored by Ambassador Panikkar, which was sad.
Mr. Ambassador, I must ask you this, and I ask this question to every scholar who is a Chinese expert, who is an Central Asian expert. Nehru wanted a friendly relation with the communist China. Why did Chinese backstab Nehru?
The Chinese, from my point of from the Chinese point of view, they became aggressive towards India after 1959, when India gave asylum to the Dalai Lama. Before that, China was reasonably friendly with India. We had the 1954 Panchsheel Agreement. China, of course, felt that certain territories like Aksai Chin belonged to China. They didn't know much about Arunachal Pradesh, about Nepal at that time. So they were not too concerned about that. They were concerned about maintaining law and order and peace in Tibet, which was slowly revolting against Chinese rule. So by 1955, 1956, a revolt had started in Tibet against Chinese rule. And that is when China started becoming unsure of its position in Tibet. Till then, between 1950 and 1954, the Tibetans were quite willing to accept Chinese rule in the expectation that they would have autonomy. But after the Great Leap Forward, that dream was shattered. And Chinese repression started, and the Dalai Lama took shelter in India. That was the time when China
So,
really became hostile
Mr.
to
Ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, you are telling me this. You are, in other words, saying that Chinese and Nehru had a good relation in early part of the 50s. The problem began in 1959 when we gave asylum to Dalai Lama.
Largely, yes, that's true. Because Nehru was clear in his mind that he was not going to take up the cause of Tibet or Tibet's independence. In fact, he at one point wrote that he was not going to follow Curzon's policy, whatever Curzon's policy was. That's a different matter. But Nehru was clear that he would recognize Tibet as a part of China as long as China respected the autonomy of Tibet. Now, that again became a disputed point later on. But in 1951, China had signed an agreement with Tibet promising to respect Tibetan autonomy and the Tibetan institutions. So, from Nehru's point of view, this was quite acceptable that Tibet would enjoy internal autonomy and it would be under Chinese suzerainty. And China continued to respect that till about the mid 1950s, when things started going wrong for China because the Tibetans were not prepared to accept Chinese rule.
Mr. Ambassador, I have my last 5 minutes left for this Zoom meeting. My last question to you. What is the current status of Tibet and what's India's stand on it?
India's stand is that Tibet is an autonomous region of China, but it is a part of China. India at one time had a consulate which was closed in 1962. India maintains that the Dalai Lama is an honored guest. He's a spiritual leader and he is welcome to stay in India. He does not carry out any political activities and he's welcome to stay in India. Globally, almost all countries recognize Tibet as a part of China, whether it is under Chinese suzerainty or sovereignty. Britain used to say that they recognize Chinese suzerainty over Tibet. There's a very minor difference, a semantic difference between sovereignty and suzerainty. In any case, in 1908, the British Foreign Minister David Miliband said that this old distinction between suzerainty and sovereignty is gone. Britain recognizes Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. Tibet is a part of China, and Britain no longer stands for for Tibetan independence. And even this new act that the US Congress has passed, this Dissolve Tibet Act, which talks about self-determination, the right of self-determination for Tibet and the Tibetan people. Even that act has been signed by President Biden. But while signing it, President Biden made a statement saying that that the US recognizes Tibet as a part of China.
So our stand, India's stand on Tibet it is an autonomous part of China.
Yes.
Mr. Ambassador, I must thank you for lecturing me, making me understand this entire region and making me understand where Tibet is and what does China stand upon as far as its stand on Tibet is. I once again let me hold your book once again for the readers so they buy it, read it, and understand the region. What is happening in Central Asia or what has happened in the Central Asia during the Great Game. Pleasure talking to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please subscribe to our channel Roportaj and press the bell icon to remain updated.